Chris Smith for Paul Murray this Sunday night. Only a cameo, as I say. He will be back tomorrow and we're looking forward to that. Well, the Prime Minister has vowed to cut red tape to get the economy moving, and I reckon he's quite serious about that. And you think about what he did when he first ever came to power. He got the public servants in, all the top public servants, and had a real talking to with them at a large gathering to indicate that he wanted to get things done. But he's got the swamp to contend with, the Canberra swamp. You can make only so many changes to the federal public service. It can be rather incalcitrant, especially when it comes to red tape. According to research from the Institute of Public Affairs, red tape is at an all-time high and is a real threat to our prosperity. Joining me now is Evan Mulholland, Director of Communications at IPA. Evan, good to have you on again. Thank you, mate.
Thanks for having me on, Chris.
Now, this, of course, was one of Donald's most successful campaign slogans, draining the swamp. Is our swamp as chronic as theirs? Surely not.
I believe it is. Now, the Canberra swamp we define as subsidising, the subsidisation of marginal viewpoint that argue for bigger and bigger government. We've estimated this costs Australia about $8 billion a year. This includes public sector wage premiums, public broadcasting and funding non-profit and other groups that argue for bigger government. We've got 38% of all non-profits are actually funded by government, and some of them do good work, but a lot of them actually argue for increases in the size of government. This is a real hamper on our economy. We've estimated that red tape costs Australia $176 billion per year in lost economic output. And that's businesses never started, that's licences, that's people filling out forms, spending time and energy on that, and delays in major projects that are never built.
But don't departments and department heads do their own auditing regularly of what might be, too much red tape or too much duplication? Don't they do that regularly? And if they don't, why don't they?
Exactly. And well, they do regulatory impact statements, but we don't believe that's the best method. There is a better way. We like to back up our research, and the IPA has been working with the Mercatus Centre at George Mason University in the US to find out the best tools available. They invented a tool called RegData, which actually goes through and uses regulatory learning and text analytics to download entire pieces of regulations and actual pinpoint the restrictiveness clauses. So find words like must not, shall not, prohibit or anything that creates a regulatory action. We use that as a benchmark to Australia. It's worked in 12 states in the US. We brought it to Australia and found there are 356,000 regulatory restrictions on the books in Australia, and there's been a 421% increase in that since 2007. Now, there's been a
Who's driving this, Evan? Who is driving this?
I believe it's all the bureaucracy. A lot of it was the Rudd and Gillard government, but there was actually a 3% dip in red tape when Tony Abbott was Prime Minister, because he started a red tape reduction drive, and now the next fellow after him didn't seem to have too much an appetite for it. But what we can learn from this is that when there's leadership from the top and there's actual methods in place in holding the public service accountable, that's when you get real red tape reform. So there needs to be, we think, a blunt measure like a 1-in, 1-out rule or a 1-in, 2-out rule like Donald Trump has implemented in the US in order to get red tape down.
OK, let's call it the way it is. We know that Labor governments like to employ public servants, and you only have to look at the number of public servants that have been employed in Queensland and Victoria in these current terms and the previous term for the Labor Party to understand how chronic they are when it comes to employing people in the public service. They're probably as bad, if not worse, than any government we've had at the federal level. Would you agree?
I absolutely agree, and there is a correlation here between the size of public service and the amount of red tape. We did a state-by-state analysis of restrictiveness clauses in red tape, and the top of the charts is Queensland, and coming up second, not far behind, is Victoria. They're on about 120,000 to 115,000 restrictions between them on the books, and this is hampering economic growth. Private sector business investment to Australia is hovering around 11%. That's lower than the economically hostile Whitlam years. So you've got to wonder what these governments are up to when the growth of the public service is far outstripping population growth.
So the lawyers would be happy because there's something that needs to be lawyered before it's put into legislation and then has to be followed up by lawyers. And then on top of that, for every restriction you have, you've obviously got a work unit that needs to, one, police it and probably, I guess, enforce it. It just breeds more public servants, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. And what needs to happen, there's two things that needs to be happening. Public servants need to be held accountable. So the Department of Environment bureaucrats, their number one goal at the moment is to look after the environment, and good on them. But they need this dual accountability of, yes, you need to look after the environment, but you need to make sure you're not implementing legislation and regulation that's hampering economic growth or hampering business development. Or every time you need to introduce a new piece of regulation, you've got to get rid of two others.
So Evan, are you suggesting that the Department of Environment are the worst offenders?
They are certainly up there. Some of the restrictions, including native vegetation legislation and laws that create economic lawfare, environmental lawfare, are some of the worst. The second thing that's required is leadership from the top, and I do believe we have that in Australia under Scott Morrison. He has a red tape as one of his top economic aims, and is appointed probably one of the brightest stars of the Morrison government in Ben Moreton as the minister responsible for the drive of deregulation. Now, they're doing a lot around simplification of regulation and making businesses more compliant with regulation. That's a good thing. But coming onto 2020, they really need to start focusing on how to drive that actual reduction in red tape over time. I think that's probably what is going to see that $176 billion figure come down.
Okay, you make a very good point. Stay there. Now, for our WIN viewers, that's all we have for Paul Murray tonight, but have a great week ahead. For Foxtel viewers, though, you stay put right there. And it's Paul Murray later we'll get to after the top of the hour. I wanted to just ask you what you thought of that story today that I thought was an absolute classic case of having too many people in the public service with not much to do. And I'm sorry for those people in the public service who work hard. I'm sure there are some. But there we had the Prime Minister's office and the loos in the Prime Minister's department labelled with this sign about urging people who want to use the toilets to use them to suit their agenda, their gender. And I just thought, why would you put on a toilet? Just go to the toilet that suits your gender. Of course they're going to go to the toilet that suits their gender. Why do we have to say that? And what a terribly PC thing to do. And then all the heads of the departments involved in this had to stay up late into the night and then came in earlier in the morning, no doubt with their minions, to try and control the signs that had to be brought down, because my mate Ben Fordham raised it with the Prime Minister and he was having none of it. You must have read that and thought that is so typical of what you know in Canberra.
Yeah, it seems like the public servants were running around like wild geese, trying to figure out what to do. Once Ben Fordham raised that, quite rightly, I mean, we don't need signs telling us which bathrooms to go to. I think it was a bit of political correctness gone mad, and good on the Prime Minister for fixing it up. Yeah,
great stuff. You know, in some ways, red tape is the number one answer you get from small business when you say to them, what would you change about Australia to make sure that we can employ more people and make a bit of money in our pocket from our hard work? Is red tape not the first thing they say to you?
It is absolutely the number one issue, but we've seen examples around the world that once you start cutting red tape, it leads to economic growth. We've seen that in the US. We've seen that in British Columbia. In 2001, they were the worst performing state economically. They had a new government that came in and said they wanted to cut red tape by a third. They implemented a 1-in, 2-out rule, and over 3 or 4 years went from the worst performing state to the best. And I think that's telling and a lesson to be learned in Australia.
OK, well, with the research that you've done, and I know what Scott Morrison is doing, you've made that quite clear, so he's on it, and I think, as I said, he's sincere about what he's doing. But has he checked out, or has someone in the Prime Minister's office checked out the tools that you've taken from the United States here that could be, you know, impacted or used in the system to cut this damn red tape?
Absolutely, absolutely. We've been working very closely with Ben Moreton. Hopefully he's taken our ideas to heart. We can only provide the information that's in our research. We're a research organisation, so hopefully he's had a read. I think he certainly had a read of our book, Australia's Red Tape Crisis, so he seems to be very capable in terms of how to cut red tape, and hopefully with the leadership provided by the Prime Minister, they start to get that red tape burden down.
Okay, but there's a particular attitude at the upper levels of the public service. You know it well, we all know it well. How do you change that?
Well, that's why you need the systems in place to make the public service accountable. Now, it's a very blunt measure, but I believe, you know, the old Kerry Packer line of every time you introduce one piece of regulation or legislation, you've got to find two old ones to throw out. And by doing that, you actually see a kind of set and forget mentality, and you see the economic dividend from that. The more rules you get rid of and the longer you have it going for, you actually get into the real red tape that hampers productivity and hampers small business growth. We've seen small business, the growth of small business well in decline over the last 10 years. So. And big business, they can deal with regulations. They've got the lawyers, they've got the corporate affairs team, they've got everything else. It's small businesses that are harmed, and the Prime Minister's certainly looking at the 0 to 1 factor. Once you're a sole trader, the hoops you have to jump through in Australia to get to one employee or two employees are very hard and very difficult to navigate. So that's why if you want to cut red tape, you actually have to start doing some structural industrial relations reform as well. So I think he's got to start on those two things. Yeah,
well done, well said. Keep at it, and hopefully for the sake of small business, this happens sooner rather than later and red tape doesn't get in the way. From the Institute of Public Affairs, Evan Mulholland, thank you very much for your time.
Thanks again.
Good stuff.